crucial role that brings together housing, economic development, essential needs services, business incubation, and real estate development serving Kent County. Through his leadership, Ross has helped secure over $67 million in funding for community improvement efforts, resulting in over 300 families increasing their assets, training over 600 residents, and improving over 750 homes, and creating over 120 full-time jobs in our city. So, next to him is David Allen. David Allen is the 3rd Ward Commissioner for the City of Grand Rapids and the Executive Director of the Kent County Land Bank Authority. He has served 20 years as served 20 years of experience in the urban community revitalization and has founded several successful community-based development organizations, including Oakdale Neighbors, City Visions, and Lighthouse Communities, now LINC Up. And last, but certainly not least, we have Nancy Haynes. Nancy is the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan, and she has served as Secretary for the National Fair Housing Alliance Board of Directors and has provided independent, consultative, and training services to a broad range of government, community-based, and political public interest organizations, as well as the private sector. Haynes also serves on the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance Board and the Civil Service Board for the City of Grand Rapids. She is a past member of the Community Relations Commission for the City of Grand Rapids, and she is a member of both the state and local bar associations, and is a past president of the Women Lawyers Association of Michigan West Region. She is very active in the Grand Rapids Public Schools through volunteering and serving on the PTA for C.A. Frost Environmental Science Academy. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you coming out to discuss these important subjects for our community. So the first question to start us off, I would like each of you to give your definition of gentrification and what exactly you understand this issue to be. So, Darel, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Thanks for allowing me to speak tonight. I think, to keep it simple to me, gentrification is when opportunity moves into a neighborhood and that opportunity is not directly for or aligned with the indigenous population of that neighborhood.
Yeah. It's gentrification is a term that's battered around a lot, oftentimes by folks who don't know what it means or think they know what it means. What your definition of the term really is, I think, is from a point of perspective. So, but I once heard somebody a lot wiser than I, a gentleman by the name of Bob Lupton's done a lot of work in Atlanta, give a definition of gentrification, and he talks about the etymology of the word, which is the gentry or the moneyed ones coming back to the neighborhood. So when you think about white flight, you think about folks leaving the neighborhood with all the resources. You see stores closing and banks closing, and when folks who left start to come back, then they start to bring all those things back that they took with them from the neighborhood. With that as a definition, you could probably think, well, gee, maybe that's not such a bad thing, but it is. And it's, to me, in its truest sense, and from my perspective, gentrification is when the folks who have the least amount of ownership, so you're talking renters, low-end renters, are being displaced from a neighborhood because property values are going up or because there's just more opportunity being created in a neighborhood and they're not able to seize on that opportunity. So it's really, to me, it's really about displacement, and it's about folks being driven out of a neighborhood where they might have lived for years. There's a lot of causes for that, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but to me, it's ultimately about displacement, and it's about the folks at the lowest rung of society not being able to capitalize on the opportunity of, say, a rising market.
Gosh, this is the downside of being third, because they both said it so eloquently. But from a fair housing perspective, gentrification means the lack of opportunity for certain groups of our population that have lived in communities for a long time, raised their families in communities, and then as opportunity moves back in, they're pushed out and they can't take advantage of that. And what we say from a fair housing perspective is, who doesn't want great schools for their children and parks for their kids to play in and access to jobs and transportation? So it's involuntary displacement.
Well, I don't know what to say. You've said it everything. Just in brief, gentrification is one of the processes of neighborhood change, and there are several of them that probably we get through tonight. But it's a process of neighborhood change that results in, as has already been mentioned, displacement of the original inhabitants due to so many reasons. And it also, as part of the neighborhood change, it also turns the neighborhood into sometimes a completely different area with all kinds of new developments. And what that brings is that it like every process in the neighborhood or in the urban area, it has its winners and losers. And so I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you. Working off of what y'all are saying, I think that there's what we think of as gentrification is a disconnect between the neighborhood and the opportunities that are available. Could you speak a little bit to the difference between gentrification and the revitalization of a community?
I think that's just it, right? Gentrification is the sum net total of revitalization without it being tied to the indigenous population of the community. So you're not a revitalized commercial corridor if 2 blocks behind you, i.e. Logan, Sigsbee, and everything looks the same, and the social determinants of health are the same, and the social outcomes are the same. So gentrification is just that. We use revitalization. Think of revitalization as nothing but sticks and bricks. Gentrification occurs once you start mixing the social fabric of community, and it's devoid of people. So once revitalization happens without the residents of that community, once businesses are popping up and they're not owned by for the benefit of people in that community, once the net sum results of the profits made aren't pouring back into that community, once the jobs created aren't for the people of that community, and the unemployment rate isn't changing in that area, that net total is called gentrification. So gentrification allows people to prosper in other people's communities without ever thinking twice or slowing down or taking the lived life experience or those people into account as part of their success. And I think that's what happens. I think in Grand Rapids we have a lot of revitalized areas, right? So, I mean, if you drive down Division Street, it looks revitalized. We have brand new buildings. We have, floor-to-ceiling facades and glass, but the same amount of food shelters, the same amount of meals being served, the same amount of homelessness and so forth. So we got to be very careful. Revitalization is a sticks and bricks type of activity. We need to elevate our game where revitalization in Grand Rapids includes people. If you're not talking about people, if you're not talking about the social fabric of communities, you're not really dealing with revitalization. You're dealing with buildings. And a lot of times that is the definition of what we define is how comfortable are we at the build design of neighborhoods versus how intentional are we on the social fabric and real change that we're causing in communities.
Let me illustrate that point this way. The thought just occurred to me as you were asking the question. Back in 2000, when we were considering launching what eventually became Lighthouse Communities LINC, I was then working for an organization called City Vision, and my partner, co-director, Earl James, a very thoughtful, very intellectual individual, said, he says, we hear all these neighborhood groups saying they want another housing organization started, but why? Because, at that point, there was more than just Habitat. LINC didn't exist. There was more than just Habitat, ICCF, and Dwelling Place. There was several smaller groups. There was probably, I think, 6 different nonprofit housing corporations. And so we engaged in some community meetings for the better part of 18 months. And at each meeting, we'd start off the meeting by saying, so you're saying you want another housing organization, why? Why? And repeatedly, we heard 2 things. We heard, we're sick and tired, and Don't mean any disrespect towards anybody with any of those organizations. They're all great organizations in and of their own right, based on the mission that they have. But what we heard from the neighbors was, we're sick and tired of these nonprofit housing corporations coming in, building houses using all white suburban contractors, and there's no local contractors, there's no local impact. So they built a house and they left. It's done nothing to the neighborhood. We had one situation where we saw a house on a street that hadn't had a new house built in I don't know how many years. That would be called revitalization. And I was at the door with an organizational partner of mine named Deb, and Deb talked to the neighbor because she knew her. It was an older lady who'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, and she says, "Who's building this house?" And literally her answer was, "Honey, I don't know." She said, "Every day a bunch of white guys come in and they build it and then they pick up and then they leave. I have no idea who they are." And so, you know, when we founded Lighthouse, now LINC, it was with the core value that the financial benefit of what happens with this housing, and Darel's right, it's just about sticks. It's not just about sticks and bricks. It's about what happens in that neighborhood. So we're really intentional about economic revitalization, using local contractors. If there wasn't a local contractor, we tried to raise one up and help them get licensed and bonded and insured. So truly, revitalization isn't just a visual appeal of a neighborhood, but it's truly the overall health of that neighborhood is what will determine revitalization. We'll get to this in a minute, but you know, we talk about affordability in this town, but nobody ever talks about what people earn and the lack of earning potential we have in our city. I think that's actually a bigger issue, but we'll get to that. But revitalization is just to piggyback with a real life story about what Darel said. It's truly about what happens in that neighborhood, other than just the homes or the businesses being built.
So I think that revitalization is really creating neighborhoods of opportunity, where by the investment that you're making, the residents and the future residents have better access to the things that lead to opportunities, so jobs and transportation and education. And it's really increasing the quality of life, not just the bricks and sticks.
I will take a slightly different look at this. Revitalization is the broader term. It means energizing, you know, an urban neighborhood or an urban community. And there are different processes. Gentrification is one of those processes. The other is redevelopment. And then there's a third one, which is called incumbent upgrading, which we'll probably, you know, talk about it through the night. But as Darel said, yeah. So in urban theory, that's what we talk about. That you know, revitalization is a broad term, but revitalization, it could come in the form of gentrification, and if it's just as you know, Darel said, if it's just bricks and stones, we call that a redevelopment, and it doesn't really mean anything. And then when you talk about gentrification, as we already have you know, indicated, it also affects the original people who are living in that community. The third one, if you really want to do it right, and that is where, you know, communities get a little bit, you know, confused about, you know, what is going on. The third one is the incumbent upgrading. And the incumbent upgrading is where you take into consideration, you know, you are revitalizing the neighborhood, but you take into consideration the people who are there and try to find a way where they can actually benefit, you know, from the changes that is going on.
So I think that especially with the talk of a commercial corridor, right? The talk of people coming into a neighborhood and building, not being a part of that neighborhood. Do you think that part of the reason why gentrification is a hot button issue now has been the consolidation of businesses and kind of the death of the neighborhood small business in a lot of our areas of our city? And if that's true, how do we fight against that? Because that's something that's happening. That's not just a Grand Rapids thing. That's everywhere, right? Well,
yes. One of the you see this all through the research and the literature and all the examples. The thing that makes gentrification such a hard-button issue is the displacement, the displacement. And I was talking to Nancy, earlier on that by definition, gentrification results in some displacement of the people, because once you invest, new investment arrives in the area and all that, other housing or businesses and other things, the price tag goes up. The people who were already there get priced out of the market, and then they cannot, they cannot afford. So that is always, the part which is sometimes is missed. In economic terms, yes, gentrification will bring other benefits, probably in terms of citywide. But when you look at the social impact, there's always that issue. If you want to do it right, then where you can actually incorporate, take care of the people who are there, and that is what I meant. That one, we don't call it gentrification because by definition, it's not. It's incumbent upgrading, where the people there, and sometimes it's done at, citywide, some kind of visioning, and it takes the people in the community to really, get together and see what can we do to upgrade our neighborhood without the social impact of displacement of the people that are here. So we can talk about that, some examples, later on. But I'll give a chance to my colleagues also to say something.
Yeah, I think that what you're speaking is almost globalization and just competition. I think it would be remiss to blame gentrification on those two dynamics, right? This isn't what's going on with inner city neighborhoods and inner city commercial areas. Isn't Walmart came in and everything was closed down. It is years and years of policy, process, and practices that have never allowed anything to be built in the first place. The reason that gentrification has come into a highlight is because it's ugly, and it looks ugly in Grand Rapids' eyes. So when you're 50 out of 51 for African Americans, we don't like that. Grand Rapids is a place we like to hide our problems well. We pride ourselves with being bad, but not as bad as the east side of the state, right? So now all of a sudden, we live in this instant data world where you can't hide behind this type of stuff, and we just discuss it more. But the same thing that's going on Wealthy Street has been the decrease of minority-owned businesses has been going on for 20, 30 years. I think if anything, my white brothers and sisters may have a stronger argument as to the effect of Walmart moving in and closing down mom and pop stores. This is actually the social construct that came out of the 13th Amendment that basically uses laws and practice and policies and criminalization as social order factors, and banking and redlining and mortgage projects as ways to stagnate certain populations. So I think we have to look bigger than this. Isn't just this national competition. And for full disclosure, I'm no longer with Start Garden. I work in the entrepreneurial space at Start Garden, which is a venture capital firm. This has absolutely nothing to do with the business cycle of neighborhoods. This is roosters coming home to roost. I mean, this is what happens when municipalities, communities, citizens, and nobody has the forethought to think about equity and feels that it will just naturally happen somehow. This is when Prop A gets rid of, and now we don't have the minority set aside in government contracts that leads to the erosion of minority construction companies and so forth. This is a result of the 2008 real estate bubble, which took over 60% of the cumulative black and brown wealth out of the community with no construct to ever put it back. And now we have an investor-led type of revitalization. So again, we need to be very, very, very succinct and honest that what we have is not this anomaly. What we have is not this mistake. What we have is the perfect result of every policy and practice Grand Rapids has put in place for the last 40 years, and we excelled at getting these results.
I think we're running on two tracks here. And they could almost be two separate discussions, the equity and income discussion as well as the gentrification and housing issue. When it comes to, I don't disagree one single bit with what anything Darel said, but when it comes to simply the issue of gentrification, what we're here to talk about tonight, people are scared because there are no places to live. Like, let's just be honest. And there has been, and I've got some numbers on this, but there has been massive, almost historic movement of people and families and displacement of families at rates that we've never even seen before in this city. So I'd almost dare say, and I don't have the numbers to back this up, so this is just my speculation, okay? I want to be real clear when I say this, but when you look at the numbers in Grand Rapids, particularly in the southeast side, as white folks left the neighborhood, as African Americans moved in, we had white flight. The displacement we're seeing now are numbers far greater than where we saw whites leaving, and it's mostly black and brown people being displaced. This I do know to be true is that, for example, City of Grand Rapids Public School System, the Grand Rapids Public School System, has had now understand there's, 18,000 students there now? Something like that? Let's just say 18,000 students. They've seen a slight decrease in families receiving free and reduced lunch. But if you take a slight decrease out of 18,000 students, the city of Kentwood has seen an exponential increase in free and reduced lunch students. So you can almost do a direct correlation between the loss of free and reduced lunch families in Grand Rapids Public Schools to the increase in Kentwood. And the city of Grand, you talk to John Hemholt, talk to anybody at Grand Rapids Public Schools, and they'll tell you they're having a hard time finding their families. And where are they finding them? They're finding them in Walker, in Alpine Township, in Wyoming. I mean, so the gentrification issue is a hot topic right now because people are scared because there's no houses. Today, as I speak, there's only 242 homes in the entire city of Grand Rapids for sale at any price point. 242 homes are the only amount of homes for sale. The cheapest home is $40,000, and the most expensive is $1 million. And that's single-family homes. I mean, that's why this is such a hot topic as well.
So that's actually what you said, rates not seen before. I think that's an important thing because I mean, we've seen displacement in the past. We've seen what makes this time so much different, if that makes sense.
I don't know if we have seen displacement like this before, actually. I think, when you've got 242 houses, single-family houses available at one point, normally we have 6-month inventory. I mean, that's a day, a week. I mean, it's just, so the competition, you list a house at $270,000 that, or let's just say $200,000. Our office is on the corner of Hall and Division, and a few years ago there were so many vacant houses, and you could buy houses for $25,000, invest $20,000, and have a really great house, or $30,000 and have a really great house that was still affordable. Now you can't buy a house for, I'd say $150,000 in that area would be a steal, and that would still require a lot of work to get it up to a point that was, Energy Star and habitable, and the hardwood floors were restored. And so I think that we haven't seen rates like this before. I think there is an unspoken problem too with vacant houses that are still just standing there vacant, and you might look at that and think, oh, how can there be such a crunch when you've got, this house on this block is vacant? But it's because banks are holding on to these. They're not moving them. They're not listing them. They're not investing in them. They don't intend, they just want to sit on them because it's cheaper to sit on it. And I was talking to Dave about this before we, yes, sure.
So the city of Grand Rapids has identified, and it's a loose number, we've identified about 800 homes right now that are vacant, single-family homes that are vacant with nobody living in them, sometimes for years. I know there's one on my block that was empty since 2012, and it just now got sold 5 years later. And so people ask the question why. Well, and I know I'm government, but I'm going to bash government. So the mortgage loan crisis, there was no oversight, which is one of the great causes of the crash. So the government does what it typically does, is swings the pendulum way too far the other way, and way too many. So what we have is, they're all large banks. They're the usual suspects: Chase, Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, Citibank. And what ended up happening is, what's the cause of these 800 homes is that the federal government put restrictions on Fannie, Freddie, and FHA because remember they were all upside down, so the government had to bail them out. Said, well, so the regulations and the restrictions are that the bank originated the mortgage, sold it to Fannie, Freddie, and FHA, and then FHA had all of its rules changed that because the bank was still servicing the mortgage on their behalf, that the property could not be reverted back to Fannie or Freddie or FHA to be sold unless it was in a certain condition. So the bank's like, well, we already wrote off a $125,000 mortgage on it. The house has gone to crap. So now we have to put another $100,000 into it to get it back into the condition in order to legally get it back to Fannie and Freddie. It's cheaper for us to spend $30 a month and have a company come and mow the lawn and make sure that there's no city violations. Now, granted, these are not blighted houses, and I could take you to there and show you this. That's a major problem in the city, major problem. But you also asked the question, what's caused this historically?
Yeah.
I really think it's a perfect storm, a perfect horrible storm. So you have a massive influx of folks moving in from out of town that have been transferred here. And to them, neighborhood boundaries don't matter. So if you've been born and raised here, and you might think, oh, I'd never live in that neighborhood. There's people moving from out of the area like, yeah, that's a great neighborhood. I'll live there. It has no boundaries to them, and there's no inventory anyways. And then there are those, and you can't really blame them. At least I don't. But folks who entered into some of these markets, particularly some of the older African American families that have bought in some of these neighborhoods, where now finally their value's back and they could sell, and there's an investor willing to buy it. And then the biggest problem is just coming out of the mortgage loan crisis. And NPR did a great story on this. There's been so many investment companies that have bought up these and flipped them into real estate investment trusts, and they're just sitting on these properties and jacking up the rent, and which is eliminating rental. So I mean, it's those things combined that are really caused this shortage.
And you have to add that throughout the country, living in cities is just cool. So to millennials, and I mean, I'm part of it, right? My daughter goes to Michigan State. I paid something crazy in the dorm. So she's like, hey, Dad, I can get an apartment this semester. I'm like, how much is it? $400 cheaper than a dorm. I'm not thinking pricing, right? So I'm not thinking like, oh, for a one bedroom, I'm paying $1,200 a month. So the people of East Lansing, I'm gentrifying because that is crazy. I'm looking at it compared to dorm room prices. That's a deal. So you add students and you add this coolness of moving into cities. And the other thing we have to add too is what's going on. This isn't like rocket science. This is like the momentum and pace and the cycle of real estate and development. So it's our municipality's job to be in front of this, right? You invest in tipping point neighborhoods before they tip. You can't retrofit in affordability. We all know if you look historically at any real estate market, it's hot one century or one decade, and it kind of moves and so forth. We know that the displacement now is going to go to the outer ring suburbs, which are now Wyoming and Kentwood. These are things, people, we can predict. The reason that this phenomenon happens, it isn't this perfect, with all due respect, it's not this perfect combination of all this stuff. It's a perfect combination of not giving a damn about marginalized people who it affects. Right? And that's really what happened. But finally, the only reason, and be clear, because I've been in affordable housing for a long time. I've owned a lot of properties for a long time. The only reason we're talking about affordable housing in Grand Rapids is it has turned into a housing affordability issue for people who aren't low income. So now for the first time, if you're at 80-90% of AMI, if you're a working family and you're making $70,000 or $80,000, those people can't find houses. Oh my God, now all of a sudden we have this housing crisis. So now we have moved into this crazy world, right, where, yeah, it's like the opioid crisis, right? Lock them up, shit. I'm telling you, like, lock them up. I got a solution. We did it in the 90s with crack. It's called lock them up. This is what we're doing now all of a sudden. We have this huge issue that's on the top of everybody's mind, and it's important because it's a housing affordability problem. When this was an affordable housing problem, nobody would listen, and it still is. So I would still say, think about it. If the community is reacting this much because we have 80,000 to 100,000 a year families who can't buy houses, and all of a sudden it warrants all of this reaction, and we have housing trust funds and all this, think if we really just were proactive when it was just an affordable housing issue, right? But the issue that we're dealing with this as a municipality is for the first time, this transcends socioeconomic class. And now nobody can find a house at 30% AMI. So now all of a sudden, this is very important for those poor folks who've been doing this. But real talk, the affordable housing crisis and finding affordable housing has been pretty stagnant. It's like when the stimulus came in, remember, stimulus came in for the majority population when unemployment got to 9, 10, 11%. The minority community stays in a constant state of 30% unemployment. So when you're in poverty, when you're in marginalized communities, when you're in these demographics, these issues, when they finally address it to today's point, the reason they're overswinging is because they're not even addressing it for that segment of people. If you look at the housing work that I've been fortunate or unfortunate or lucky, however you want to call it, enough to serve on 3 task forces, half of the recommendations came out for housing affordability, not for the lowest of the low affordable housing who really needs it. Because clearly we put our energy and we put our time into policy that affects the most of us. And in Grand Rapids, we continuously to define that group as everybody except those who need to be championed the most.
To be sure, the swing of the pendulum on the bailout was and the over-regulation was to protect the investors. It had nothing to do with protect the people that lost their houses.
And to address, the affordability issue, you can't define affordability as a percentage of AMI across the metropolitan area. You have to address it in 49507, in the southeast side neighborhoods around Hall and Division. And it's got to be defined by the neighborhood, because affordability based on the metropolitan area would never be affordable for the neighbors, and that leads to displacement. So we're not even getting there yet in the city of Grand Rapids. We're still talking about, well, we should go up to 120 AMI because, it's really those people between 80 and 120 that are getting squeezed. No, it's really the people that are the lowest earning income wage earners in our city that have nowhere to live.
I do want to toss one thing out, and then maybe the professor might have a follow-up comment on this because it's a matter of geography. I'm also getting a little bit tired. I don't deny at all this is a major problem in Grand Rapids, but this is a regional issue. And we do need to start talking about some regional approaches, because part of the problem too is our outer ring suburbs have basically master planned or zoned away any form of affordable housing. There's one ring suburb, I won't tell you who it is, who's actually banned Habitat from even building in their city. Basically has said, we will not allow Habitat to build in our city. So this is a regional issue as well. So, if you wanted to build some kind of a large-scale affordable housing complex or something like that, maybe on South Division, where you're on the Silver Line, you literally can't do it. There's structural issues there where, A, it's not zoned for it, or B, Michigan won't fund it because it's not in the central city. So, there's some bigger structural issues here that are regional from a geography.
Yeah, that is correct. And oftentimes planning sometimes can just forget that the city of Grand Rapids is part of a broader area, and so whatever goes on here is not just created. In fact, if you trace some of the causes of this, you can actually see that they go beyond the boundaries. And sometimes because of politics and others, it's not very easy to have a regional approach. But that is a very important point, because of the interrelationships that the city of Grand Rapids has with the surrounding areas, and it goes all the way past Kalamazoo and all that, because there are people who commute between these two places, and do all kinds of things. Yeah.
There are many people
the regional approach is very important.
Actually live in Muskegon and commute to Holland or to Grand Rapids because that's the nearest affordable housing that they can find.
So, man, it's a lot of good stuff. So one thing that I would ask would be, what should the goal of the city's housing policy be? Because there's a lot of things the city can't, we can create these partnerships with these surrounding areas, make it regional like you're talking about, but there's a lot of different ways and goals of housing policy. It could be to make housing cheaper or to build density or do all these different things. So what should the overall goal of our city's housing policies be, given the reality of gentrification, as well as the fact that it's a regional problem?
Well, I will answer that question by asking, what is the current housing policy? Is there any any housing policy of the city. No, you know, yeah, because if we know what is the current policy, then we can talk about it. But if there's no policy, it's just like everything goes, then that's a different thing.
And to that point, I'll ask. I know David is loving to jump in here. It doesn't matter the specific tools that we use. Mm-hmm. It's identifying the opportunities, right? So an affordable housing policy in Grand Rapids has to have definitions. The biggest thing that the leadership of Grand Rapids can do is start defining things, right? What is a healthy community, right? Like, what is that? Is that 30% renters? Is that 30% affordable housing? Is that 70% home ownership? So we play these games, right? But you can't get to a goal you can't define. So you hear a lot of people, we need these healthy communities. Healthy communities are this mix of socioeconomic backgrounds. It's this mix of density and different build structures. But if you really challenge them, the city of Grand Rapids does not have a formula or even an idea what that looks like, right? What is the amount of density that's okay? What is the mix of units that's okay? What is the mix of homeowners versus renters that's okay? What is the mix of affordable units versus market rate that's okay? And then, and this is a hard thing because it's politics. I'm not in politics, so I can say it. Then you have to choose neighborhoods, right? Because you can't retrofit affordability in. Your commissioners can't tell you that, but the west side is gone. It doesn't matter how many units you add. Let's say you add 50 units, they're adding 5,000 in the next 3 years. So it's finding the tipping point neighborhoods. It's being bold enough to really have definitions on this is what a healthy neighborhood is. Understanding it could be up for debate, but we have to shoot for something. And then it's a housing mix type. Sometimes auxiliary units work. They work in Heritage Hill. They have big garages and some of those. It may not work in Alger Heights, right? But where can we increase density? When is it appropriate? And then how do we then use definitions, goals to actually set policy so that's not a continuous conversation of not in my backyard, I'm a good, well-intentioned person, or I'd rather managerialize this damn issue so I'll never have to come up with a policy to it.
So you really put me on the spot. But I'll go there. So I'm just one commissioner. I'm one of 7 votes. So you're only getting my opinion. But mostly what I'm about to say, and I'll be brief, mostly about what I'm about to say I've already said from behind the dais. So I've been very vocal on this. My dad always used to tell me, back when I was a kid growing up in a household that was a household of faith, a Christian faith, my dad always tried to get me to give. Right? And he always used to say, you could tell what your priorities are by looking at your checkbook. In other words, what you spend your money on. Well, I think you can tell what the priorities of a city are by what it spends its money on. And in this city, policing, we can always find money to fund things that we think are important. So we found out there was a tree crisis. I'm not denying the tree crisis. Miraculously, we came up with $2.5 million to take care of all these trees. Just like that. I think that, and I think we actually might see some things come down, at least some recommendations coming down the pike, not tomorrow, but certainly coming down the pike on this from the Rose Center Fellowship. And I don't want to steal any of their thunder, but for as long as I've lived in Grand Rapids, which has been since '93, we have incentivized development in the downtown core. It's done. I just don't know how else to say it. I mean, I don't know why we keep incentivizing development in the downtown core. We need to find ways to incentivize development at the neighborhood level and specifically for the purpose of creating affordable housing. So a good example is if you're a neighbor and you live in the Belknap neighborhood, you hate it, I'm sorry, I had nothing to do with it, I'm not in the second ward, but when Grand Valley jumped over the highway and bought up 4 city blocks, they actually needed the city to vacate an alley. That's the only thing they needed from the city. But they literally couldn't build what they wanted to build if the city didn't vacate that alley. So the city drew a line in the sand and says, unless you build affordable housing more than what you're tearing down on this site, we will not vacate this alley. And the city stood firm and for 2 years argued with Grand Valley until they finally relented, and they're including affordable housing on that site that they're funding on their dime. And what I'm tired of is we keep hearing, from various sectors of our city to say, well, it's illegal to this, or it's illegal to that, or it's illegal to this. My understanding, and I'm just an armchair lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, so we need maybe lawyers like you to get involved in this, but my understanding is that if the city has to give an exception, or if the city has to be involved in a project in any way, the city can put requirements on it. So I really think we need a policy that requires affordable housing, and I'll just give you one example. So if you're a developer and you're developing downtown, this city has bonuses that you can get. So you can add a bonus floor if you add a bike rack, or you could add a bonus floor if you put green on your property. And what I've always contended is, and Darel and I, we've done development. We know what it costs to develop $1 million developments. We've done it, right? So the cost to add a floor, if your pro forma works, and I'm getting a little wonky here, but if your pro forma works at 4 stories, and you're given the ability to build another story, it's not dollar for dollar added costs. So those added units can be affordable housing. And no matter how many times our developers in the city keep telling me that's not true, so instead of allowing developers to pick and choose which of these little daisy-picked incentives, I think affordable housing should be a requirement to add a floor, not just one of the things you can choose from. It could be both and, but it needs to be a requirement. So I really think there are some things the city could put in place if it had the will to do it. And I think now is the time to do it, because the city has never, ever been in a better economic place than it's at right now, ever. And I'm going to finish with this, and I'm going to keep harping on this is a regional issue. Our county is sitting on a 65% fund balance. That means what it costs them to operate in a year, they have another 65% of that sitting in an account doing nothing. Our county is literally just has tons of money, and they're not getting involved in this issue whatsoever, and I think that's wrong, and I think they need to be held accountable for it.
Okay, so for the next question, so we're talking a lot about investors and developers, because that's who's doing the building. And a lot of the developments that are coming into our neighborhoods are making a lot of people scared. And there is talk of community engagement from the development side. How can a developer take into account and really hear the neighborhood that they're coming into, especially in the communities of color that are for large part being displaced and fearful of this kind of change coming into their neighborhoods?
Well, it can't happen after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's got to happen on the front end before the first property's purchased. And I think it's disingenuous, and it assumes that the people, the current residents, are foolish or fools, and that's not fair. And then you can't, it's got to be sincere and authentic. And I think, there are great examples that, LINC has done it very well. And, we were part of just a tiny aside, but we looked at how banks were maintaining properties in minority neighborhoods as opposed to white neighborhoods when they foreclosed. This was several years ago. We looked at how the Wells Fargo properties. And what we found is in 49504, which is a predominantly white zip code, they looked like any other house for sale. They had for sale signs, they were well maintained. And in 49507, they looked boarded up, abandoned. There was trash, there were broken windows, there were needles. It was really dangerous, and there were auction signs hammered into trees on the property. And so we were part of a national lawsuit, or actually a settlement with HUD, and we were able to bring $1.42 million to invest in 49507. And we knew that we weren't a foundation, and we didn't want to be developers, but we knew there were a lot of organizations that were doing incredible work in 49507. And so we partnered with LINC and other groups in the area to figure out what the community wanted and what the priorities were. And then we funded those groups to do the work that needed to be done based on the priorities laid out by the community. And I'm sure we were new at this, and it was the first time we'd ever done anything like this, and we learned a lot. So hopefully the next time we have a settlement like this, we can do it even better. But I think that we were sincere and authentic in our intentions, and I think the community trusted us because of that.
Yeah, I think that's it. You just have to be authentic and honest, right? I think the biggest issue in development is we need to be just very brutally honest. some things that are good for a developer aren't good for a community. Some things that are good for a community aren't good for a developer. Instead of acting like that tension doesn't exist, just be forthright and have that and make that a community engagement conversation. I've done developments where literally the community's power was to speak into the brick color. But we were honest about that, is we're adding affordable housing. Because, I mean, it's all funny, right? So, like, now it's gentrification and so forth. Try to put up affordable housing kind of like in an affluent area, you get the exact opposite pushback, right? So, I mean, so just in the context of engagement, you just have to be honest and say, you know, this, as a developer, this is what I've heard. This is what I think that I get it right. I think that that's easy to say for a nonprofit developer because we build with the community context in mind. I think for for-profit developers, you need process and policy. And Dave kind of spoke on it. You have to remember, government moves like slow. So in government's eyes, we're just coming out of the recession, right? So we're still living where our policy and procedures just incentivize any development. Because from a policy and procedure standpoint, this is the same environment where you need to give developers any and all incentives because there's a banking bubble, nobody's lending, nobody wants to build downtown, and so forth. Now, we know the environment is totally different, but we still live in an environment where everything is pro-developer. So you have the developer, you have the municipality, and community groups siding with the side of development. I think ultimately what we have to get to is understanding communities should be unapologetically pro-community. Developers, it's okay to be pro-development. Just be authentic and honest. And we have to get to a point where that municipality is that honest broker and that neutral party and actually represents development for the sake of increasing the tax base and revitalization and so forth, the same way it represents community voice and making sure we have community engagement standards and processes and so forth. Right now, that's our biggest opportunity is if you align the city departments, they simply, it's written in a pro-development way coming out of the early 2000s and so forth, which quite candidly, if it wasn't, we probably wouldn't be in this boom of today. So it is kind of that pace in holding commissioners and elected officials and just the city, planning department and so forth, just feet to the fire because right now communities are the strongest voice for community. And really in a lot of ways, communities are organizing against planning, zoning, the city, municipality, and developers. So what we're working to do is figure out how do we continue to work with the municipalities, how do we work with the city of Grand Rapids so that there truly can be that neutral party that facilitates those conversations and doesn't have policies to push it one way or the other. Because Dave says, like, when they stood firm on Grand Valley, it works. When they stand firm, it works. However, you can do so much things without having to go to the commission. You can get so much stuff built by right and so forth. It's just not written into the everyday policy and procedures to bring in that thoughtful thinking.
I want to add just, yeah. I think it all starts with having a policy and a plan. No, because it's too late when the developer is there starting the project. You know, so in order to have that conversation, it must be written somewhere. There must be a vision for the neighborhood, and then when anybody comes in, that provides a basis, you know, for the conversation, so that things will go the way. And it's not going to be, you know, the community may not be able to get everything, but the developer may also not be able to get everything. But there could be some compromise once the blueprints are laid down before that.
Well, I think that, you know, the fact that we have this room full, and thank you all for coming out tonight, I think people are really looking to get engaged in this process. How do you suggest, if a citizen is concerned about the state of their neighborhood, the state of development, and the things that are going on in relation to this issue, how should they engage with our city government and with our city officials?
I guess I have to answer that. Truth be told, I didn't know about this forum until Friday, so
we appreciate you coming out.
I didn't have time to even prepare. Call your commissioner. Go online. Their contact information's on there. That's the first place to start. you know, as a commissioner, the one thing that I could say that frustrates me when I have people contact me to talk about an issue in a neighborhood is, so we have so many different models out there. So we have the neighborhood association model. We have neighborhoods that aren't even covered by neighborhood associations. We have, if you define neighborhood associations by what the city defines neighborhood associations, we actually have neighborhood associations, but they're not recognized as neighborhood associations. We have nonprofits. We have advocacy groups. We have, I mean, the list just goes on and on and on and on. So when people come, as a commissioner, if they take the time to call me, I'll sit down with anybody, and hopefully my history will show you that I do that. But it's like, well, too often I hear people come and say, well, I'm the voice of the neighborhood. Well, that's a big neighborhood to say that you're the voice of that neighborhood. You know, like, so, you know, going back to process, one of the things that frustrates me is if a developer is going to develop in a neighborhood that has a neighborhood association, it is a policy part. I think it might be part of planning or zoning where they actually have to go meet with the neighborhood association. The neighborhood association has to sign off on that. But we have neighborhood associations where there are people who live in their geographic target who say they don't represent me. You know, they're constantly fighting with their neighborhood association. So the city's saying we need to get this entity to sign off, but maybe that entity doesn't even speak for that neighborhood. You see what I'm saying? So, so that's just, that whole process is a very frustrating process to me. And for developers, you know, I think as a developer approaches a neighborhood, I think they need to realize that if they're developing in a neighborhood, neighbors, especially those that feel that they're not being heard, the first thing they're going to do is fight and oppose, because that's the only power they have. So they're not going to want to come join you because then they've already given that power up. So it's a, you know, how do you get involved? Call your commissioner. We're trying to make the website more friendly. Know what's coming on. You know, the Planning Commission publishes everything that's important would have to come before Planning Commission. So take a look at that. Put it on your calendar, check it, see what's coming before Planning Commission, and then something might have missed you and you want to speak to that issue. That's kind of how I see it. What I, as a city commissioner, I'm trying to do is when there's a major development and how we define that, I think we need to talk about that, back to Darel's point about definitions, but a great communication tool we could use is the water bill, and we have the ability to mail those in very specific areas. So if there's a major development, I think the city ought to put something in the water bill that every household in that neighborhood gets that and says, hey, do you know this is coming? Come to this meeting. Those kind of things. I think the city could help in that way somewhat, but I'd just say start with your commissioner. Blow their phone up.
I would say, how do you get involved? I would say aggressively and unrelentlessly. Just to be candid, because right now, if community groups don't stand up for what they want in their community, they need to understand that there's nobody else right now. So they're doing two things. Not only are they fighting for their community and the standards they want in that community, they're also writing the blueprint for how it needs to be done citywide, right? So it's important work right now neighborhood groups are doing as they interject themselves into the development process. There's also a few development processes going on that are highly influential, right? So, I mean, I think you've seen the influence of community groups in Grand Valley kind of set the whole new model on now how to engage. I think so one thing community groups need to do is understand that, I'm an activist and an advocate, and I train, and I used to tell people, like, it's two things, right? You either have each other or you have money. Neighborhoods will never have the money to fight developers, right? The money or the time. What they have is each other. So you have to unrelentlessly engage and push back about the standards you want. And that's regardless. It's not about if you have an ASP. As a developer, I've worked around that. I've also facilitated ASPs. So you have to stay present.
Area-specific plan.
Right. You have to stay present. You have to stay aggressive. You have to stay vigilant. You have to stay part of the process. Because development, quite candidly, is a mathematical game. And right now, the only argument we have for developers to care about communities is we're trying to pull on their moral heartstrings and tell them to make less money. So until we get a true policy with true incentives and some true processes, it is up to the neighborhoods and residents to really stop this momentum that's going on. Again, and not to be discouraged, because they're fighting two fights for their neighborhood, but they also are demonstrating the power of collective voice and how we need to bring that into policy and process.
And we can't.
Yes, get organized. and get involved, because there are so many examples across the country that community groups have been successful in stopping some of these things that could have ruined, the neighborhoods that they live in. So don't think that your neighbor is going to do it. It's all you all should be part of it.
And let me jump in. If you have a development, and this is coming as a developer and somebody who has done lots of development. If you have a development going on in your community that developer is not listening to your community voice, please be wise and understand that development is not for you or your community, right? I mean, so part of it is we got a peep game, right? Like, so think about it. What developer wants to spend millions of dollars on a project for a community that doesn't want it? That would be a money loser, right? So if you find yourself opposing a development and you're at odds with that developer, you're probably onto something, because 9 times out of 10, that development was never intended for that population, that area, and they're building for somebody else. Because the first rule of development is sustainability. Whether I'm a commercial developer, I want to make sure businesses are going in. I want the neighborhood to like me. I want them to be part of it. I want them to feel proud of. I mean, when we built LINC and Madison and Hall, they were like, oh, you got too many windows. We made sure we went to every door, and we wanted to be part of that neighborhood. The neighborhood makes businesses successful. You have to kind of stop and think, like, what's going on when people are doing things in neighborhoods without residents of that neighborhood, and who are they really doing it for? And I think that's that first trigger to kind of engage and get active and start pushing back, because a good developer knows, I mean, and we learned this in Project 49507, like, a good developer, it's good business to do what the neighborhood wants. That's called a sustainability plan. The West Side, the reason they didn't need anybody from the neighborhood to buy into it, they were developing a whole new market and a whole new West Side, right? And that's why people were left at the side arguing and didn't really understand. So I think there's other neighborhoods that are pushing back a lot more, and they're peeping that clearly this isn't for us, because if it was, to Nancy's point, you would have caught us before you accumulated all of this property and before you asked what you wanted to do with it, right?
And we can't rely on neighborhood associations because they are so underfunded. They rely on volunteers now. I mean, the city has not invested in our neighborhood associations. The Planning Commission meetings are now going to be televised, and so that's an opportunity for you, before you actually go and speak at a meeting, you can watch a few and figure out, how the language and how to attend and how you want to make sure your voice is heard. But also, there's a Policy LINC has a great equitable development toolkit, and you can go there and click on affordability or economic development, but it's the Policy LINC website, and they've got just a great toolkit about community engagement.
A couple things to add. Darel won't like this, but there's a couple commissioners, because he's on the Planning Commission. There's a couple commissioners and I talking about the time that the Planning Commission meets, because it starts in the middle of the day. So if you're a resident and you want to come complain about something, the meeting starts at 1 o'clock. Like, okay, well, you're going to miss work to talk about this? So, unfortunately, I think the Planning Commission needs to maybe look at their schedule, make it a lighter schedule, but needs to start at like maybe 6 o'clock and go into like 10 o'clock, like City Commission does.
It's broke, so please log in. It's broke.
So, and I have two other real quick things. Number one, and this is just me as a city commissioner, I'm just speaking personally. I do want my constituents to call me. I do want them to ask me questions. If they hear rumor of something, call me. I'll confirm it if I know it's true. I'll find out if I don't know about it. But if you're going to oppose something, particularly if the developer owns the property, at least understand that, talk about what's not negotiable. Talk about what you want to see happen, because if they already own the property, and I'm not just talking about in the Amplify area, I'm talking about anywhere. Once the developer buys the property, they're on that property. It's theirs. So oppose it, but at least be concrete about what it is that you want. Too many times I have people call me and say, well, I'm against this, I'm against it. And I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about other areas. I'm against it, I'm against it, I'm against it. Well, why? Well, just because. Well, there's got to be some, or what alternative do you want, or what do you want that's different? What's missing? What's not included? Just be a little bit concrete, because it really helps your case. To be honest with you, I had a constituent call me today, and I was on the phone with her for 45 minutes, and I asked her in a 45-minute period 8 times, what is it that you're asking me to do? And she literally couldn't tell me. And the last thing, I think a really good example of really effective community engagement is the state not too long ago passed a law, and I don't know exactly what it is. Darel, maybe you do because it's a planning issue. Basically, removing the amount of feet around a gas station that would allow them to sell beer and wine.
Yeah, they can sell beer and wine.
They can sell beer and wine now. So what happened is every gas station in the city ran to get a liquor license to be able to sell beer and wine. And a couple passed in spite of the fact that the neighbor association vehemently opposed it. So what's coming before the city, because we received so much feedback from residents as well as neighbor associations and business owners, what's coming before the city commission tomorrow is a moratorium on that until we can figure out some things we need to put in place to help deal with that.
That you should vote against, but we'll have an online. But that's the part of policy. To Dave's point, so I'm on the planning commission, he's on the city commission. This gas station selling beer, right? I mean, state passes a law, now Myers can sell beer. It seems like an open shut case, right? Like, okay, you can buy beer from gas stations now. The law and the policy says because that they simply have to come for a license. So community who comes in was like, well, you know what, not in my backyard. I don't want beer sold. This is where, to Nancy's point and to Dave's point, knowing how to talk to the commission. So we literally had 10 people line up in planning commission. We don't want beer. We don't want drunk people. We don't want anything. We can't deny because you don't want it. Nobody said it goes against the character of the neighborhood. It goes against the design. You know what I mean? So there's certain things. So that's a policy point. So if we're talking about community engagement, we need to make sure that the ordinance then reads that it has to go against the material character of the neighborhood or the desire of residents. Then when community steps up and speaks, we can actually vote to say no. Instead, what you get is bureaucracy. So you get, quite candidly, what you get is an inequity, right? So guess who came first to get the license? Myers, Shell, all of the big gas stations. Then you get a city staff member who gets heat from the commissioners because, oh my God, you guys are passing all this. She puts forward a moratorium. Guess who now is not going to be able to sell? The local business owners, right? And this is what happens when we just react to different things, right? So, and this is totally not about gentrification. You don't do a moratorium when the train's on the track. That's called backwards thinking, like, right? So, I mean, that's kind of like, but this is where we get. So none of this stuff is that easy. So you have community groups, you have us saying engage, yet we have policies and procedures and ordinances that unless you know how to engage properly and say those right 3 or 4 things, we can't even take that into consideration on our vote. I cannot take the fact that you don't want a gas station selling alcohol in your backyard. I can't take that into account as a planning commissioner to tell that business owner no. But we're also saying we like the will of the people and people should be able to speak into their neighborhood. That is the ordinance and policy. We just skirted the whole issue. We're going to do a moratorium. It'll die down. We'll come back. We'll start licensing again. And this is, again, so engage, but to Dave's point, be very, very, for lack of a better word, intelligent and understand what you're engaging for and how do you change these actual policies? If not, you're going to get, like Grand Rapids will managerialize the shit out of anything. We will put a moratorium on it. We'll put a commission on it. We'll study it for 6 months. We'll then come out with a report. We'll then come back in another 6 months, think of everybody who wasn't at that first commission, and we'll do another one, and we'll update the report, and we'll do it, and we'll get into these cycles, and no policy will ever be changed. Make sure that your comments, whether it's the planning commission, city commission, is about a very specific policy piece that's hindering you from getting what you want. To just talk to us about what you want, we probably want it too. But yeah, you got to. That's really my point. And sitting in the chair of a city commissioner where people come to me that and let me flip the script on that a little bit. You probably know this, but there's city commissioners each have their own thing, right? So and I could tell you each commissioner or the mayor what their thing is, So, and it is what it is. There's things you're passionate about. There's things you have experience with and whatnot. So oftentimes if we're the person speaking on this issue, it's easy to be marginalized. Oh, that's just Dave speaking. He's always hollering about that. But if I can give 100 people some really good information,
about how to approach in an intelligent, informed way the city commission. Now all of a sudden there's 100 people coming before the podium speaking it. Then all of a sudden it has more volume and it has more, and that's how I like to operate as a city commissioner. I just as soon not be the one always doing it, but I don't want to say set up, but help inform and engage and educate folks that they're coming and dealing with it. And that's how I personally, I don't know about any other commissioner, I know that I'm that way. I know Commissioner Lanier in the Third Ward is that way as well.
Wow, all right, thank you. So what I'd like to do is, if you all could give a final thought, and then we'll go into questions.
My final thought is I'm in so much trouble when this is over because I've said so many things. I see Amy in the front row, so that's okay. I'll own everything that I said.
Mine is just engaged. Like stay engaged. Don't assume anybody wants more for your neighborhood than you, and don't assume like everybody is your enemy. I mean, we need to get past this interpersonal relationship and look at the policies and structures that are perpetuating these inequities and things in our neighborhood that we don't like. And I'm saying this, and I'll fight with all of them, but I'm saying this candidly. We probably have one of the best commissions ever seated, and increasingly so after January. If Grand Rapids isn't the city we all collectively want to be in, that's because we have collectively failed to deliver specific policy. We can engage and we can stand up and we can stomp. What we have to do is start delivering very specific policy and give them something to move on and to vote on. If not, trust me, I got a big mouth. They're always willing to listen to me. They'll listen to us till the cows come home. We have to deliver on policy to move on.
I think my final point would just be that we have to demand the community that we want our community to be. We have to demand it. We have to demand investment of resources. At this point, the affordable housing crisis is severe, and we have to demand resources be invested in this. And we have to speak up, and we have to engage, and we can't get weary because our children's opportunity to live in this community that we grew up in really depends on it.
I would say that what is happening here is part of the processes of urban change or neighborhood change, and I will add to what support what has already been said, that you are the only people who can manage that change. You need to get involved. And if that requires the need for some policy, some plans, and other visions that will be developed so that it will help you to deal with that change, then that is what you have to be. And also get in touch with your leaders and let them know your thoughts.
Okay, thank you all very much. I really appreciate you all coming out. Okay, so now, for the remainder of the time, wait, we're not done yet. I mean, not that you can't leave, but clearly. So now we would like to open the floor up to any questions. We have a microphone at the left-hand side of the auditorium, and just a few codes of conduct. Listen actively, respect when others are talking. Do not be afraid to respectfully challenge one another by asking questions, but refrain from personal attacks. Participate to the fullest of your ability. Community depends on the inclusion of every individual voice, and like I said, we'll get to as many people as we possibly can. And the goal is not to agree, clearly. The goal is to gain a deeper understanding of the issue that we've all come here to discuss, and be conscious of body language and responses and things of that nature. So,
Steve, can we go ahead and start with that gentleman?
Yes, sir. What was your question, sir?
Thank you. generally don't have trouble being heard. They told me to keep it down, Vinny. Anyway, there was some racial disharmony in 1948 when a Ford Motor Company was bringing a lot of people up from down south to work, and so that led to some riots. But there was still kind of a concurrent housing boom that went on in the city. That left the inner part of the city open for people to step in, buy it up, and start renting all those properties, okay? Now, you may not know this, but in 1967, I was an EMT paramedic, and I was in the middle of that summer riot. And what we saw was blocks of the city on fire. And they were rental properties. Anything that was owned by anybody that worked at Ford Motor or had other decent paying jobs, those houses didn't get burned. A lot of the businesses that got burned were businesses that were taking advantage of the neighborhood. And so minority-owned businesses weren't burned, okay? So you'd go down, you see whole blocks, there's a building. In 1962, it was the best year for the auto industry, absolutely the best. And we had, in 1962, we also lost the Ford Rotunda. Does anybody know? I'm going to do this real quick. Anyway, my point was, here we live we have a benevolent oligarchy that kind of looks over the city. And I don't want to see Grand Rapids come up with a bus tour that says, this is Boston Boulevard, this is Greektown, and those are the casinos, and in between it makes Aleppo look good. So I think we need to keep a look at that, and when we're putting these neighborhoods together, we should be doing that. We should be revitalizing, putting new life in it, not gentrifying it, which is making life better for those that already had. And I'll close by saying that when you asked about definitions, I thought that with revitalization, a rising tide raises all boats, okay, and everybody in the neighborhood benefits. But when you have gentrification, it's like a tsunami sweeps through there, and only the oligarchs' yachts float, and the fishing boats that belong to the people that work are tipped over, and the fishing market is destroyed. So I think
Okay, so any responses to that particular question? Okay. All right. Okay. Yes. So what was your question, sir?
Hi. My name is John Fetter, and I think I see a lot of people I know in the audience. I've been on the front lines of affordable housing, usually triggered from crime, combating crime, and then you get into an arena where that's, it starts doing some overlapping. In the early 90s, I was also on the Housing Board of Appeals for the city of Grand Rapids. I did a 4-year tenure there. During that tenure, you see a lot. You see a lot of problems. You see a lot of issues. The one thing that I really need to express here, and it's going to echo a lot of what Darel said, it's called grassroots activism. You can call your commissioners all you want, unless you hit upon, or you're lucky enough to have a commissioner that has an open ear and is willing to understand what your specific neighborhood problems are. If they're not willing to listen, you're not going to get very far. The secret is talking to your neighbors. Once you start talking to your neighbors, no matter if it's just a one group, one street, 2 streets. We just started something in Garfield Park. It's called Union Oaks. So we've got 6 streets. Yeah, we've done a great job of eliminating crime, but you know what we're going after now? It's called changing the mindset. You have to change the mindset of people who are renters.
Yes, sir, but do you have a question for the panel?
Yes, well, so my question is has anybody ever considered doing an series of affordable housing workshops where you bring everybody into play? Banks, realtors, people who work in credit. That's my question, or that's my proposal. So.
Yeah, ad nauseum. So I think I think you're hitting it on the head. I mean, I think those groups meet all the time.
I think it's when you infuse those groups with grassroots leadership and actually on the ground and residents that you actually start getting movement. But it's a lot of politics. I mean, what we haven't said and what's politically incorrect to say is the flip side of gentrification, right? That is higher tax bases. That is, quote unquote, at least the perception of safer neighborhoods. That is, so the flip side, there's a lot of people working for gentrification that's in these conversations also, because gentrification doesn't happen with just housing in isolation. It's that intersectionality of unemployment, poverty, housing, and so forth. But yeah, I think Dave can attest to this. I mean, I think the commission is always meeting, lenders are always in the room. Everybody's wrapping their head around what to do about it. But it's from a very fiscal and business standpoint, and we always need that community voice to be that voice of reason and equalizer in those conversations.
Yeah, no, I understand there's a huge dynamic going on, and, you know, there's lots of elements that enter into it. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, appreciate it, yeah. Good.
Thanks, sir.
Hi, everybody, how you doing? Good. This question might be a little bold, but never rude at all, of course. So now that this is a Caucasian problem, from what you've seen, gentrification has now trickled down to you. How do you suppose that we together decide to have these conversations to where we can find out what the solutions are to begin to talk to city commissioners, legal personnel, lawyers, and whoever else? And then also for me, by the way, my name is Cameron. I'm looking to get into real estate investment. I'm studying it right now. I'm taking classes online with Jay Morrison, if you know who that is. Give a woo-woo. But anyway, in the place of where I want to be as a real estate investor and start a black co-op, a black business co-op, where do I find my space when you have only 262 homes in areas of places that are not available with policies that never end ever? That's the question. And then the next thing is, as far as when it comes to speaking to anyone for renters, you're a lawyer, is that correct? Okay, so I was moved out of my place when I took a medical leave of absence, didn't find a job in time, and they, instead of reevaluating my rent for low-income housing, they illegally, from what I learned, took me to court and evicted me without reevaluating the cost of my rent. And when I went to court downtown, it was here, the judge, after I pulled out the documents of information, I read out what was actually illegal from this document because I studied. I didn't want to have to move. It was a nice place. What was legal enough for me to then go about making sure that this doesn't happen again, or for me to combat that? Because if it's illegal for me to be able to be pushed out of my place and not have reevaluated rent, then why am I still not living there? So I hope that's not too much. Yeah.
Well, the Renters Alliance, there are sessions that are available at no cost, and it alternates at the Urban League and at Steepletown, and I can give you more information about that. But you can take your documents and you can sit down with a legal aid attorney right there, and they can advise you of your rights. No.
I'm sorry. The legal aid actually told me that this is something that they don't deal with.
No, but they can tell you about your rights. They might not represent you, but they can tell you about your rights.
Right.
That's part of the Renters Alliance, and I can give you more information about that.
Yeah, that would be great.
As for one of your other questions, I think one tool that we haven't talked about is last year or 2 years ago, HUD issued a regulation under the Obama administration with regard to a community's responsibility when they take federal dollars. They have to use those federal dollars in housing to affirmatively further fair housing. And so I think that's an unused tool. With this new administration, we're a little unsure what's going to happen. Those kind of rules that were put in place that we fought so hard to get in place are kind of being removed from websites and other things. But I think until we haven't seen any backing away from that, and that's a tool where we can, as a community, can pressure cities when they're making decisions about siting public housing or investing public dollars into developments that they have to make sure that they're doing it in an equitable way, and making sure that our communities of color are not being discriminated against in how those resources are being used. And so I think as a community, we need to use that tool. It's the AFFH regulation that HUD just issued. And I think we're just trying to figure out how best to do that to preserve it so that we don't lose it under this current administration.
Okay. Thank you. And the investment question, buy low and sell high, so just avoid Grand Rapids if you're getting into real estate speculation.
Yeah, you know,
Muskegon Heights.
That's really good, because I just took a trip to Washington, D.C., and I've seen the numbers are like whites are 46%, and then blacks are 43% of the population. So I'm like, let me, find a space where I can branch and whatnot. But of course, this is where I spend most of my time, and I would love to stay here, but how can I also ask these questions? What do we as black people want in our neighborhoods? I don't want to get arrested for soliciting, knocking at the door, asking questions to people who don't know, what's going on. How do we get to ask those questions to people that are there before that happens, and to the neighborhood, basically?
I don't think you'd be arrested for knocking on a door, talking to your neighbors, saying, knock on the door. I think if someone knocked on my door and said, let's talk as neighbors about what we want in our neighborhood and in our community, we wouldn't call, the police wouldn't be called. So I think you've got to knock on the door, or, talk to your neighbors and keep expanding the circle out. We can't rely on neighborhood associations because they're just so underfunded and understaffed, unless you've got time to volunteer, because that's what the neighborhood associations need and the community organizations need.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, this question is for Dave. Thanks. It's great to call your commissioner. I think that's a great idea. But a year ago, the city created a housing advisory committee, which released its recommendations today. Correct me if I'm wrong, Frank. And they will be discussing that tomorrow night. So you could just tell all these people, if they're worked up about this, to come and see those at the city commission 4 blocks away tomorrow night, right? I mean, 9:30 tomorrow morning is the initial release for discussion, and they could come to the city commission meeting tomorrow night, just a few blocks away, to hear about those things that we're supposed to be addressing this issue, right? Just to be clear about that. They would be welcome to come and voice any complaints in the closing minutes, right? That would be,
absolutely, and they're just being put out for discussion purposes. They're laying them out in detail. It's being put out for discussion
purposes. That would be hearing the city's plan about these things.
Yes, exactly right. And it's not, you not only have to, if you can't come to the meeting, it's going to be televised as well. So, and that'll be broadly put on the city's website. You'll be able to link and watch the entire conversation, see the entire thing. So even if you can't make it physically, but certainly the city wants as much input as possible on those issues.
Good evening. My name's Will. I've been getting into data science, partly with the interest in applying it to housing issues. I'm wondering if you could speak about the role of data with these issues, or do you think it's like all the answers are there in terms of the numbers? What we have is a problem with initiative, basically.
I mean, I think the data is super important, and I think part of the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation, part of what HUD moved to is the provision of data sets, where before each community, this requirement has been in the law since the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, but it was just not enforced by HUD. So some communities did take their responsibility to make sure that all people benefited from HUD dollars, and some didn't. And Westchester County, I don't know if you heard about that case, but it was multi-millions of dollars over 20 years that was not being invested to the benefit of minority communities, and Westchester County had to pay that money back to the federal government. So, but I think part of the AFFH rule is that those data sets and those mapping are available now for communities, and they're supposed to use that data to figure out local priorities and then work those into the consolidated plan, reporting out to the community progress on the consolidated plan. So it's really data-based planning and moving the plan forward. And so I think that we've got to have that data to then develop the plans, but the community has to be involved in those conversations, because otherwise you can make data say anything you want. And so having people who understand how to use that data and understand how other people are using it is key.
My name is Bill Peterson. I've lived in the city of Grand Rapids for 66 years. The last 43, I've lived on Cherry Street by Union. I've been through developers. I've been through being shot at. I've been through upscales. I've been through all kinds of stuff. But the current problem is gentrification. But my definition of gentrification is the political process by which someone that lives in a house gets priced out of it. And I didn't hear much addressing of that on this panel. So my question or comment or whatever would be, is there any way you folks with your political connections can first of all discuss this issue, and secondly discuss what could be done about it or not done, in that could you have, say, a fixed tax rate starting from when you bought the house that wouldn't go up as long as you lived there, and that if you had a certain portion of years you've lived there plus your age would mean that the city could not send its people in and force you to do a whole bunch of work you couldn't afford just because you want to live in your own house.
So I don't know if I have a complete answer. The short answer is part of dealing with gentrification is definitely keeping people in their house. I know a group that we're working with Invest Health, which is Spectrum Health, LINC, Start Garden, the Source, and so forth. We're looking at 0% interest loans to existing homeowners, like they have modeled in Detroit. They have one in Philadelphia. But I think the conversation is now moving into, well, I think it's one, how do you create more units? How do you create density? I think the conversation now is definitely, okay, now how do you keep people in their existing homes, right? So I think we're getting there. I mean, and I'm not a politician, so I can say the conversation that I'm having, that is on the radar. I think there's so much conversation on just displacement of everybody and renters and low income and transitional housing, that's taking up the most of the oxygen in the room, but definitely how do we keep homeowners in their house has to be part of the equation. I think also, and Dave can speak to this, I think the second part is how do we create more homeowners? So I think we've talked a lot about affordable rentals and making sure there's rental units available, but what we have is a unique comeback, right? And from the economy, we have like a jobless and wageless recovery. So even though the economy is doing awesome, even though you look at all this, wages haven't really gone up. And this recovery, banks haven't really opened up lending, right? So especially in real estate, the financial opportunity for the upside in real estate is probably way smaller than it was 10 years ago. So I think that's the conversation, and then how do you have it very respectfully and smartly, right? Because what we don't want is just to open up the floodgates again and give everybody a mortgage, and you have balloons and adjustable rates and so forth. So that keeping people in their house, I think, has to be part of that conversation. Going back, we have to engage. That has to be part of the conversation. And to add, I think the city of Grand Rapids currently has funds for homeowner rehab, and historically have not been able to get them out the door. So it's kind of a hard conversation process-wise, because a lot of homeowners don't want a second mortgage from a government entity, even though you don't have to qualify, even though, it does disappear and so forth.
You still have to pay for it.
Yeah.
We're really running out of time.
Yeah,
but in the interest of time, there is something that's not been mentioned here that I think is really important, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. And I've been asked respectfully to kind of hold off until a new city manager gets in place before I place this on the table. But, and Bill, you touched on it, is that the way our housing code enforcement is handled is there's no equity at all. In fact, I think it's oppressive for poorer people or people of color. And I could go on and on about how that is, but it's basically a complaint-based system. So the only way somebody is on the city's radar with a code enforcement issue is if somebody calls and complains about it. Well, what happens in a gentrifying neighborhood when you have more people moving back in, all of a sudden, little Miss Jones that everybody in the block knows, and she's struggling, and every once in a while they get together and they help her clean her yard, or they do the things for her, they mow her lawn, you know what I'm saying? Now all of a sudden you got neighbors that don't know her, that don't really care because they're worried about their house, they start reporting it. So what I've been advocating for is a carrot and a stick, where we change the system where if it's a principal residence and you've been there for a long time, then that's referred to a completely different department. It's not even handled by code enforcement. Maybe home repair services, and we set aside some funds to help folks deal with those situations, which really will help people stay in their house, because ultimately what happens is the city vendors that work, and then it's a lien against the property, and then that whole process gets to be really difficult.
Yeah, well, if you
that's
want
a system that really needs to be changed.
If you want to hear horror stories about that, we'll be here till next Friday, and I'll spare you, but I think you could have a well-attended, separate meeting on that subject using the word code enforcement in the title, and you would have you're going to need a lot more space than what's here.
But, I think you brought up a great point about what are we doing to keep people in their homes. And so I think that's got to be a part of the solution. And we didn't have a lot of time to talk about solutions. But, I also think, in the short run, rental subsidy.
The other thing that's fairly obvious here is that a lot of the people that are getting forced out of where I live.
Okay, sir. I'm sorry. We do need to get. We have 3 more people. If we could get in there real quick.
That there are renters that are being forced out, and the people that are renting are getting charged a lot of money by the various government organizations before they can rent.
Hey, I'll make this quick. I was just wondering, what advice can you offer as it pertains to those of us who don't have political experience but are interested in putting forth policy or the bones of policy? What resources, what groups, starting off point? Because you talked about, bringing forth housing policy to the city or offering and somewhere to start.
I think the first step is, either work with local nonprofits, LINC. Every Tuesday goes to City Commission. You can come have dinner, go to City Commission meeting. They have them work groups around different issues. There's a lot of other housing, specifically. But I think you figure out what area you really want to work with and just find some nonprofits. I think increasingly nonprofits and community groups are getting into policy work, but there's definitely a capacity issue because nonprofits are usually funded for people to deliver services, not necessarily work on long-term policy. So definitely an area that if you're in the community, you have some expertise, you have some time. You call any local nonprofit, and they'd love to sit you down and put you to work.
All right, thank you, guys.
Okay. Find out what you're passionate about, because housing is a very broad issue.
Peace. Name's Divine Booker. My question is specific to Darel Ross and David Allen. Darel Ross, you had said development is a mathematical game. I was trying to get some clarity to that, like what you understood. What's the understanding behind it?
I was saying a lot of times when communities are engaging with developers' decisions 9 times out of 10 on development is just mathematical. This is how much I can spend per square footage. This is how much I can pay per square footage. This is the return of rents and so forth. So what I was saying is a lot of times what I found out being an advocate, I was advocating from a social justice standpoint or a community standpoint, and the language they were talking was business and investor and return on economics. So I think that the opportunity is for the community groups to either get involved in those mathematics and affect that outcome, or understand that ultimately a lot of developers are willing to do that quote-unquote engagement or listen or whatever to get to their price point, because ultimately development is always driven by a mathematical equation.
Okay, thank you. David Allen, specifically, this panel is speaking a lot on community engagement, and you seem to be promoting community engagement, but I have in my hand right here a flyer, and you and I both know that we came to the city commission and actually, made requests in regards to our third ward commissioners and amplified GR developments. And when you speak about engaging the community, this is something that has been going on for around a month within that area, specifically at Garfield Park Neighborhood Association Lounge. Our city commission was invited, but here I see that the city of Grand Rapids is part of something that is organizing, like they are doing their own quote-unquote enhanced community engagement. Like that would directly marginalize the residents' voice that's already doing that in that area. So how would you continue to promote engagement for the residents but do such a thing like that when the community has openly welcomed our city commissioners to these things that we are having? Like that would be a division type of thing within our community, wouldn't it?
So I guess we got, do you want to answer just this one? This will be our last question. Sorry. The event you're talking about, I believe, is part of the Urban Core Collective. The city's one part of that. That's a meeting at LINC, and there's going to be a meeting at Roosevelt Park. I think that's what you're talking about. I'm not sure. But I'm not really sure about that. But Divine, to you specifically, you and I have spoken. You know where I live. You can knock on my door. You got my phone number. You know where my office is. You're welcome at any time. I'd be more than happy to sit down with you.
Thank you.
Okay, my question is, I just want to know when someone in the city commission is going to do something about code compliance. I'm a low-income disabled person. I owned my house in Heritage Hill for 11 years. I made the terrible crime of just wanting to paint my own damn house. And you know what? It's a huge house. It's been neglected for 30 years, and you just can't do it in 5 months when it rains half the time in Michigan. And so code compliance went after me. 20 court appearances, 2 misdemeanor charges, $3,600 in fines. Virginia Million from Code Compliance said I had the wrong attitude and she was going to get me. And as far as gentrification goes, 3 times I went to court to try to get the fines reduced. Magistrate Hartley said...
Ma'am, what was your question, though?
My question is, when is somebody going to do something about code compliance?
Okay.
Gentrification, I go to court, they say, well, if you can't keep up in your neighborhood, maybe you should sell your house, move into apartments for disabled people downtown.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's appalling, and I want to know when someone's going to do something about code compliance. They're a terror on homeowners. They take in $2 million of fines. I have a city commissioner sitting here, right here, and no one's doing anything about it.
So this is a Darel Ross, because I will get in trouble if I represent anybody saying this. It's a policy and procedure, right? The first thing that should be done with code compliance is we should demand that neighborhood associations who are funded to look out on behalf of neighborhoods are not paid to do code compliance. The system in which the city of Grand Rapids uses neighborhood associations as pseudo layers of government to then get free labor to go against the same neighborhoods that they're supposed to organize against is tragic. So again, organizing, I think it starts in the neighborhoods. I think it's going into your neighborhood association and with a lot of neighborhoods.
My neighborhood association is the person that made the anonymous complaint against me.
Oh yeah, because neighborhood associations now, understand, neighborhood associations funding is tied to doing code compliance for the city of Grand Rapids.
Correct.
That is the advocacy opportunity, is we have our own neighborhood associations who are going against the neighbors. So again, it is that. I would also argue the one place that residents have an enormous amount of power is the neighborhood association meeting. Show up, you and 10 of your neighbors, and say this is ridiculous. If you need to raise money, we'll find other ways. Then the neighborhood association goes and talks to the commission and so forth. But as long as we have addressed government cuts by putting the work on neighborhood association and tying them cut their funding, tying their incentives to actually policing the work that the municipality should do, we're going to be in this spiral. So the Darel Ross of it is start with your neighborhood association and your commissioner and stop them from getting incentivized Neighborhood associations should not be incentivized to turn in their neighbors.
And I could say, and Darel can attest to this, this is something that I've been fighting this for a long time before, when I was executive director of Lighthouse and Darel was on the board, and then Darel took on after I left. This has been a fight, and there's some great neighbor associations, don't get me wrong, they do great work, but they're a sacred cow. So that's something where we need a broad spectrum of community voices on, because as a city commission, that holds a lot of weight.
Okay, thank you all so much. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you very much. And if you did park in the lot, we do have green tickets for your validation. So, thank you.
What's up?
Oh, and we also have surveys at the, I know we're kind of crunched on time, but we do have surveys on your way out. If you could fill one out, we'd appreciate it.